Alrighty, there's an election today for the president of Turkey. Erdogan, who has been the president of Turkey or the prime minister, I think he used to go back and forth for about as long as I've been alive, if I remember correctly. I mean, wasn't it like the late 90s when Erdogan first came on the scene? I mean, he's one of these guys who's been, like more resilient than Netanyahu. I mean, his name never seems to go away. But I was looking at the results as they're coming in. They're about 80% counted as the time I'm recording this, and I didn't want to wait for it to get to 100% because I got time to record it now. So some of this might be a little stale in a couple hours. But as of now, it looks like there's a chance that this goes to a second round. Because the way that presidential elections work in Turkey, it's not like this in the United States, but certain countries, France, others, it's a two-round process. We have this in a couple of U.S. states like Louisiana and California. You have a first round that's kind of like your primary, where it's a whole, what we call a jungle primary in the United States. You've got a bunch of different candidates run against each other, and the top two candidates, assuming no one gets above 50% of the vote, no one gets an absolute majority, the top two candidates go to a runoff, and then that's the real election. And so as of right now, the past few elections, if I recall correctly, Erdogan has not gone to a runoff. He's won over 50% outright. But this time around, he's currently at 50.4%, and I believe his lead was bigger at the start of the day, so his lead has been shrinking. And so he's getting closer and closer to 50%. So with 20% left of the votes left to count, he can only lose 0.4% of his, before he gets below 50%. Now, the only person who has a chance of beating Erdogan in a runoff is a guy whose name I cannot pronounce, but he's considered to be someone on the left, whatever that means in Turkey. That means something different everywhere. Some people are describing him as, Western, U.S. Brussels shill. Others consider him, and certainly he himself would consider himself to be much more independent and just have his own foreign policy. And of course he says, of course, I support whatever's best for Turkey. It has nothing to do with what the West wants. I don't know if that's the case, but just based on a cursory overview, and maybe I'll link to this, there's a decent Zero Hedge article about this guy's foreign policy. It doesn't seem to line up 100% with what the West would want. He seems to lean towards normalizing relations with Assad, which is something that the U.S. and the CIA certainly is very much against. They're definitely with Erdogan on that one. And he also wants to, I guess, like Erdogan, but there's some nuance here. He wants to increase, he wants to revitalize the old Silk Roads and build, new roads going to China and connecting China to the Mediterranean and having commerce that flows across all of the Turkic countries. So these are the countries who are, descended from the Turkic tribes, which conquered what is today Turkey, and defeated the last remnants of the Roman Empire. And that, of course, would lead, across the Caucasus, through the stands, dipping into Iran, and all the way to China. And that, again, puts this guy at odds with the West, or at least at odds with the United States. He is more open to working with Iran than Erdogan. He is, I don't want to call him necessarily pro-Iran. I don't know if that's fair to characterize him that way, but he's less anti-Iran than Erdogan, which would line up with being more open to normalizing relations with Assad. After all, pretty much every country other than Turkey and the United States has accepted that Assad is not going anywhere. I just talked about that, what was it, yesterday? Now, personally, I haven't seen a lot of propaganda about the Turkish election in American media, so I don't really know who the American deep state would like to see win. It might be that they actually don't like either candidate. Who knows? Perhaps Turkey has become that impenetrable for the American deep state that the Turkish deep state, is a little has taken precautions against the likes of the CIA influencing them. But then again, from what I recall, The Turkish deep state has been eroded substantially by Erdogan. If you remember that whole attempted coup from a few years ago, which at the time it was unclear whether that was a real attempted coup or whether that was a false flag perpetrated by Erdogan so that he could purge the Turkish deep state and try to rein in institutional military and intelligence control over the government there, and reestablish civilian control. Now, it's kind of funny, back then I remember people acting like, this was the act of a dictator, this was like the Reichstag fire. It's like, well, when you have the elected president, even if it was a false flag, staging a false flag in order to undermine the permanent bureaucracy and the military establishment who have a history of interfering in civilian government and overriding elected officials to maintain the government's, long-standing policies, the likes, which I think we in America can relate to now. I mean, is that really such a bad thing? I mean, to me, it sounds like a good thing. At the time, I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. I know I kind of, bought into it, but it's like, because remember, the term deep state comes from Turkey. So back then, I didn't really think much about the American deep state. That term was not really being used here much, if at all, when that whole situation where Erdogan started purging people came in. So I find Turkish politics interesting. I wish I followed it a bit closer, but they don't seem to fit into the same, generic paradigms that you can find across the Western world. They seem to have different factions, which makes it more fun and intriguing. It doesn't just seem to be as simple as, okay, are they a neocon, neo-lib, populist left or populist right? That seems to be the four sides that we have in the West, and once you identify which of those four archetypes a candidate fits into, it's pretty easy to understand who they are, who their voters are, and what policies they support. So I have no real dog in this fight. I do think the idea of Turkey normalizing relations with Assad is intriguing. I think if I were in Turkey, I probably would support it, because you've got millions of Syrians that Erdogan has been holding in camps there for over a decade now, that he was always using as leverage against Europe and saying, hey, Merkel, you mind passing me some cash, or else I might just have to open the floodgates and release millions more of these the Muslim hordes, and unleash them on Europe, into Europe. It's interesting that Erdogan is not the one talking about trying to normalize relations with Assad and get these migrants out of there, since they've been there for so long. I mean, hell, if this were America, they would never talk about sending these people back. I mean, again, after over 10 years, we would just make them citizens at this point. But in Turkey, they actually care about preserving, their unique culture, and the vote, and not diluting the votes of their actual citizens. So these Syrians who are living in Turkey for years and years and years, the opposition wants to send them back home, just right across the border. These are people who crossed Turkey, and came across their southern border, and they were not allowed to, become a part of Turkish society, because they are not Turks. And I have some respect for that. And now the opposition's saying, okay, it's time to send them back. And in order to send them back, the only way Assad is going to take them back is if we talk to Assad. As long as we continue this, this petulant Assad must go policy, we have no way of trying to negotiate with him to get him to reintegrate these people into his society. I mean, Assad doesn't need more mouths to feed. That's the last thing that Syria needs. Hell, I believe their wheat fields, the most fertile and arable land in Syria, I believe, is still under U.S. occupation, along with all their oil fields. So Syria, not doing great right now. It's going to take some convincing, I think, for them to readmit, these from what I understand to be millions of people, back into their country. So, with all that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.